thank you to the Schumacher Institute for hosting this talk and this whole series. I think it's a really important series of talks this week at a very important moment in time with the coronavirus crisis. So I'm originally from Colorado in the US. I'm doing my PhD with the Stockholm Resilience Center these days. But my journey with sustainability started about 15 years ago. And it's sort of been an iteration between my education and my life experiences. So kind of kicked off with the experience of living in rural China and experiencing a lot of the social and ecological problems there firsthand. And then getting a master's degree in sustainability science from Lund University, and moving to Greece. My husband is Greek, and I moved to Greece just in time for the crisis to kick off. So also experiencing the Greek economic crisis had a lot of impact on me, and made me really start questioning how sustainable is the economy in ecological and social terms, but also in economic terms. And we'll get into that. You'll see a bunch of logos on this introduction slide. My work with this not-for-profit economy idea started with the Post-Growth Institute. And so what I'm going to present today is sort of a mix of work I did with the Post-Growth Institute before my PhD, and then also the way I've been further developing those ideas in the Adapticon project. Schumacher Institute is part of that. And also my co-author of the book I wrote with the Post-Growth Institute is Donnie McClurkin, and he really inspired, he gave me the seeds of these ideas. We developed them together, so I'm very grateful to him for that. So let's jump into it. Now, enough about me. The overview of the talk. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction to post-growth economy, just to make sure we're all on the same page with the basics there. Then I'm going to give an overview of the dynamics of the for-profit economy, which is really a lot of the work that I started with the Post-Growth Institute, but also a lot of my PhD work in further developing those ideas. I'll introduce what I mean by not-for-profit business, what that is, and the dynamics of a not-for-profit economy. And then finally, I'll leave it with transformation possibilities. And I do anticipate talking for about the full hour I was given, because it's a luxury to have a full hour to really explain your ideas. And this is a totally different way of thinking about the economy and a totally different economic possibility for the future. So it's good to have the time to talk about it. So the question that I guess this whole series of talks this week is addressing is, what might a sustainable economy that meets the needs and challenges of the 21st century look like? And here, this is that beautiful illustration from the Transition Network. And so I come at this question from a post-growth perspective. And just a few basic starting points for the post-growth perspective are that economic activity has environmental impacts. All economic activity will have some kind of environmental impact. And currently, we are in a state of ecological overshoot. So, and of course, some of us humans have contributed much more to this than others. But what I mean by ecological overshoot is that society globally is using more resources and creating more pollution than the earth can handle, than the biosphere can handle. And so we need to organize production and consumption in ways that can meet human needs within the planetary boundaries. And that means that the economy should not drive and require growth. So there should be no growth imperative in the economy. Many of you might be familiar. This is a nice little illustration of that idea that the economy should serve society and stay within the limits of the natural environment. So what are some basic principles? How do we go about that? one basic principle of all post-growth thinking is that the economy should be sufficiency-oriented, that material human needs that can be met through economic activity are limited, they are finite. And so there is such a thing as enough, even though our current economy wouldn't have you think so. Another principle is money should be seen as a means to an end and not an end in itself. And that production and consumption should be local as possible in order to cut out a lot of the environmental impact and also social impacts that occur in long supply chains. That the economy should be organized in a democratic and collaborative way. And there's always a lot of talk about sharing of resources because resources are finite. And the economy should be circular, of course, and zero waste. So using waste as inputs as much as we can. And how might that kind of economy, it's great to have principles, it's great to know some limits, but how might that kind of economy actually work? What are the kinds of institutions that we need? How do they come together to actually make an economy that's post-growth? And this is where I start with the work that I did with the Post-Growth Institute. And like I said, Donnie McClurkin, who's also a Schumacher fellow, he brought these ideas to the group at the Post-Growth Institute. And I raised my hand right away that I was excited to help develop these ideas. And what we developed was a conceptual model of a post-growth economy that we call the not-for-profit world. And it starts with the basic idea is that business is a key building block of the economy, and not-for-profit businesses exist. So I didn't even know that before Donnie brought this idea to the group in 2012 or so. I had always just assumed, as most people do, that businesses have to be profit-driven, they have to have private owners, nonprofits are something else, they're not businesses, but actually not-for-profit businesses do exist, and I'll give you some concrete examples and go into that later in more detail. And the fact that we can find not-for-profit businesses in all kinds of sectors of the economy leads to the idea that we can imagine a market completely composed of not-for-profit businesses, and that might allow for post-growth economies, that a market of not-for-profit business might not need to grow, and it might not drive growth. And then so the book that I'll be referring to throughout the lecture is called How on Earth, and it's online, and I'll show you the link at the end of the talk. But before I can go into the not-for-profit world and how generative it can be and all of the good stuff, I need to explain a little bit about the for-profit world that we currently live in and some of the problematic dynamics that the not-for-profit world can resolve. But just this idea that we live in a for-profit world, this was another big aha moment for me in this journey of coming to understand what a sustainable economy might look like. Just coming to the realization that, wow, yeah, we live in a globalized society now where for-profit businesses are a key player and the economy is made up of mostly for-profit businesses. And so what does that mean? Well, two main characteristics that are important for sustainability of for-profit business is that they have owners that are entitled to profit and assets, and that is called in legal terms private financial rights. And it sounds really technical, but this is something actually that I think we need to demystify and something we need to be talking about a lot more in sustainability and all circles of life is financial rights, and in particular private financial rights in business. And another key component of that is these financial rights, these private financial rights, actually serve the purpose of private financial gain. So owners getting enriched from the business. And so if you think about a business and it produces products and services, and then it sells them and generates revenue. uses that revenue to cover its operating expenses, including wages and rent and all of that. And the profit is the financial surplus that is left over after that. And some of the profit will get reinvested back into products and services. But in for-profit companies, usually at some point, there will be dividends of the profit distributed to the owners. And the owners are able to accumulate that as wealth, and that enables them to buy more shares and receive more dividends. And that's sort of just a normal thing in for-profit businesses. And it seems quite harmless in this depiction, and something we're all quite used to. But what I want to emphasize, and this is something that will be familiar to many Schumacher people in the audience, who are familiar with systems thinking, is that there are dynamics here in the economy that cross scales. So it's not just a business structure that we're talking about here. We're talking about these two aspects of a business structure that then cause aggregate dynamics in the larger economy. So let me explain what I mean here. What kind of larger patterns might be expected in a for-profit economy in which most businesses are operated for the financial gain of owners? Well, here's a common story, and this is I'm going to use causal loop diagrams to explain a lot of this. For those of you who are not familiar with causal loop diagrams, they are just a nice visual tool used in systems thinking to explain how the relationships between different parts of a system, like the economy, can create dynamics. So we're often looking for feedback loops. Here I've signified a reinforcing feedback loop. And so these arrows represent causal relationships. So more investment causes more production causes more sales, or the way I think of it is they tend to cause. It's not a very deterministic way of thinking about it. And so this is kind of the normal story of capitalism that we're told, right? Is that you start with the desire for financial gain, which is the profit motive. And the more profit motive there is, the more investment we'll have. The more investment, the more production. The more production, the more sales. The more sales, the more profit. And then some of that profit is invested and it goes back into production and sales. And some of it is distributed to owners and they reinvest it for financial gain. And this is sort of just the story of the economy that we're used to. You can already see some reinforcing dynamics there that imply this is a growth-based economy, that more investment feeds more profit, which feeds more investment, and the system continues to grow. But there's something even more problematic. So one thing that we notice coming from a sustainability perspective is that production doesn't just naturally result in sales, and consumers don't always just naturally want more. Rather, advertising is a clever strategy that companies use to seek profit by using advertising to encourage consumption, right? So there's some investment that goes to advertising and that increases sales. And then what else is missing from this picture? Well, right away from sustainability perspective, we'll say what the environment is missing. And so, of course, all of that production and all of the sales have some sort of environmental damage. And that's what I meant before when I said that economic activity has environmental impacts. So let's carry on here because it's not just advertising. There are lots of different kinds of profit-seeking strategies that companies will use in order to deliver financial gain to owners, which is, again, what they're set up to do. And one of the things that we see that is really problematic for sustainability and growth is planned obsolescence. So this is where companies use well, they make products and services that are intended to become obsolete before they actually need to be. So fashion is a good example of this, fast fashion, where today's shoes are unfashionable tomorrow, or our computers and cell phones, mobile phones, also are sort of designed, the software is going to go bad before the actual phone it does. So there's all kinds of examples of planned obsolescence, and all of these things together create this reinforcing feedback dynamic that I call the feedback loop of consumerism. So that's one aspect of the for-profit system that's problematic, but that's definitely not the only one. Another thing is we notice that as the profit is distributed to owners, because they have this desire for financial gain, there's also a tendency and a desire to accumulate that money and that wealth. And so it's not just all reinvested. So they'll use some of that wealth, of course, to reinvest, and some of that wealth just accumulates. And in the larger scheme of things, this helps drive inequality. But another thing that is driving inequality that derives directly from the desire for financial gain in for-profit business structures is wage suppression. So you notice here I have the wealth accumulation feedback loop, but there's also wages are a key cost of business, right? And so if you're trying to maximize profit or just gain profit, then there is an incentive to keep wages low as a key cost of business. So the desire for financial gain causes an incentive to keep wages low. Low wages will then also contribute to inequality and contribute to more profit. And then this dotted line, so this is the wage suppression feedback loop. This dotted line is, so all of these lines are backed up by evidence, and I've actually published all of these causal loop diagrams that I'm showing you in a paper called Fit for Purpose, and it's available freely online, published by the Journal of Political Ecology. And there you can read about all of the empirical evidence that backs up each of these arrows. This dotted arrow is that I haven't found strong evidence for this, but there is some evidence to believe that the more inequality there is in a society, the more desire for financial gain there is, because the steeper the ladder is, let's say in socioeconomic terms, the more people don't want to be at the bottom of that very steep ladder. Yes, so that was the inequality dynamics. And then the last, not the last, but the second to last dynamic that I want to point out here is that of political capture. So political capture is a term coined by Oxfam, I think in a 2014 report. They might have been using it before then. And it refers to the undue political influence of private interests. And of course, that directly relates to this desire for financial gain again, right? And so what I'm talking about with political capture is lobbying for subsidies, lobbying against taxes, lobbying against social and environmental regulations, things that would cost businesses money. And again, these are just logical profit-seeking strategies. It's nothing that's too dubious or that you wouldn't is not comprehensible. So the desire for financial gain drives political capture, and the more political capture we have, the less effectiveness of redistributional taxes there will be. So the more accumulation happens, the more profit is distributed and accumulated. And the less effective the labor and environmental regulations will be. And so wages can be suppressed even more, profit can go up from that, and environmental corners are cut with the regulations, or the regulations just are watered down or go away. So it contributes to environmental damage even more. So basically this political capture dynamic just strengthens all of these other underlying dynamics. So those are those three loops of consumerism, inequality, and political capture. And then there is, this one looks quite Intimidating, I know that. But I'm gonna walk you through it pretty quickly, but it's also not as complicated as it looks. So this is what I call the dynamics of market concentration. So these are the dynamics that are driving the economy to get concentrated more and more in the hands of just a small group of corporations and their owners. And so it's, again, traces back to this desire for financial gain driving investment. And so the perceived profitability of firms, and large firms look more profitable, drives investment in larger firms, which are then able to use that investment to increase their production and ads and visibility compared to small firms. And in that way, they take over a larger share of the market. And the larger the share of the market they can take over, the more profitable they seem, and the cycle reinforces. So as you can see, there are lots of reinforcing dynamics here that create, that are driving the concentration of the market on a global level, really. And then, of course, you have the role of mergers and acquisitions and these mega mergers like Bayer and Monsanto and these kinds of things happening. Which again are just profit-seeking strategies. And here's just another image, again from Oxfam, I believe, just showing that, even though these brands that you see at a supermarket all look like separate companies, these have also been concentrated in just the hand of a few companies. So, in summary, the system dynamics of a for-profit economy drive the growth of consumerism and environmental damage, and of course that's also driving the growth of the economy. They drive inequality, market concentration, and political capture. And a point that I want to really make here is the for-profit market is doing what it's set up to do. It's delivering private financial gain. It's just these other invisible hand mechanisms that we've been told should kick in haven't kicked in. So what about an economy in which businesses seek private financial gain and social benefit? And this comes more from thinking about hybrid types of businesses that you see more and more now, B corporations, and if you've heard the line people, planet, profit, trying to balance people and planet and profit as ends, still all three as an end of doing business. So what would happen in that kind of economy? And here what you see is that it doesn't, so this light blue is basically, these are all the same dynamics that happened in the earlier purely for-profit economy. But you also add in the desire for social benefit, and you add in some social benefit activities. So it doesn't fundamentally transform the dynamics of the economy, but it adds some dynamics that might balance it. So this B means balancing loop. And so these balancing loops might slow down those very destructive dynamics of the for-profit economy, but it doesn't fundamentally change them. And that's important to point out, because a lot of the time these people, planet, profit, or triple bottom line ideas are talked about as being transformative and transforming the economy, but actually it's just expanding or adding to the economy. One point before I go into the not-for-profit world is I want to make is that not all for-profit businesses are bad. That is not what I'm saying, because people who own and run for-profit businesses. So do I, including my own father. And I'm not saying that all for-profit businesses are bad. What I'm saying is it's about the system dynamics that come from for-profit businesses interacting in an economy. And the sort of race to the bottom dynamics that emerge from that. So some challenges for sustainability transformations within a for-profit system, and I think this is where a lot of activists and theorists are reaching this point where they're realizing there are some serious challenges that haven't really been acknowledged. One is that a lot of the benevolent actors and benevolent ideas get co-opted and bought out or beaten out quite easily by these race to the bottom dynamics. Political capture bends the rules to benefit the largest, most powerful players. There's a contradiction between wealth concentration and redistribution of wealth, because it's kind of arbitrary in this kind of system to say what is enough private financial gain versus social benefit. And there are trade-offs between generating more private profit and protecting the environment, workers, and consumers. So now let's go into the not-for-profit world and a better way forward, I would like to say. So what about an economy in which businesses seek only social benefit? And here I need to introduce you to not-for-profit business first, because a lot of people just are not familiar with this. Like I said, I hadn't been. And the difference between for-profit and not-for-profit business is really a difference in these three things: in purpose, ownership, and investment. And of course, all three of those are intertwined. So compared to for-profit business, not-for-profit businesses have a core social or environmental mission, which is their primary purpose. They have to use 100% of their profits and their resources for that mission. So there's no private financial rights. If you remember, I told you to try to remember that term. And there's no private distribution of profit. And thus, they have no private equity or shares, private shares. And this means that not-for-profits they see profit as a means to achieving social benefit. So again, recall the principles that I mentioned in the post-growth part of the talk, where it's talking about money as a means to achieving social ends or ecological ends. And they are held to higher standards with regard to social impact. And again, I'm talking about in comparison to for-profit. So many types of businesses are not-for-profit. It's really diverse, actually. A lot of people are concerned that going away from for-profit will somehow stop diversity, but I think that it opens up the space for diversity much better than for-profit, than the for-profit structure of the economy. So there are nonprofits and charities that do business. I imagine that many of you are in the UK, so if you think of like the charity shops where you can get secondhand clothes or goods are a good example of that. But also lots of social enterprises. For instance, the Community Interest Company Limited by Guarantee is a not-for-profit type of business. But important to note here is that not all social enterprises are not-for-profit. Some are for-profit, and then, it's something to think about given the dynamics that we explored before. Mutual insurance companies can be considered not-for-profit. They comply with the principle of non-distribution of profit or non-financial gain. Same with consumer cooperatives and credit unions. So Donnie McClurkin, my co-author, and I, we argue that consumer cooperatives, mutual insurance companies, credit unions should be considered not-for-profit, because you'll never, as a consumer member, you'll never get more out than you put in. There's no private financial gain. So to make this concrete, here are some examples. Again, for those of you in the UK, this will probably be familiar for you. The YHA is a not-for-profit business. So their business is to provide recreation and accommodation. They run a bunch of hostels, hostels and rooms for let and that sort of thing, campsites. But their social mission, their core social mission as a not-for-profit, is to get people out of the city into the countryside. And in particular, they run youth programs to get kids out of the cities and into the countryside to experience nature and adventure. And so all of their profit goes into that social mission. Another example here, and I'm trying to give you a bit of a feel for the diversity that we've found, that it's not, we're used to thinking of not-for-profits as healthcare or childcare, something like that, but we've really found them in every sector of the economy. So this is BRAC, and all over the world. BRAC started in Bangladesh. And the core social mission is to help rural people get access to healthcare and education. And instead of relying on donations and philanthropy and grants to do that, they run businesses. And this picture here is a picture of their dairy. So they run dairies, they run retail shops with handmade goods and clothes made by some of their beneficiaries in rural villages. They do microloans. They have quite a few different enterprises, and all of that, the financial surplus and the profit from those businesses goes back into the social mission of helping rural people get access to education and healthcare. Then here is home ground real estate, which I'm a big fan of, in Australia. And this is actually a not-for-profit real estate company. So they manage and sell properties and use all of their profit to help people who are facing or at risk of homelessness. And as you can see from the testimony here of Rachel, a tenant, she says, "Home ground real estate gave me the ability to move on with my life after being homeless for over a year and a half." So this is a real estate company that uses all of its profit to help people like Rachel. And my last example to make this concrete for you is a community energy co-op in Catalonia, Som Energia. And I'm probably saying that wrong. But this is a renewable energy, community-managed, community-owned energy cooperative. And so there's a lot of movement also in this sector around the world of community renewable energy. So there are the examples. You can see we covered recreation, some food, finance, housing, and energy. So really, we found the basic building blocks of an entire economy. Yes, so the emergence of not-for-profit business, because if you haven't heard of it before, you might be asking, where did these come from? Are they new? We're seeing the rise of this, or the emergence of this, in sort of two parallel ways. So traditional nonprofits are increasingly generating their own revenue through the sale of goods and services, and a lot of that has been in response to economic crises. I wouldn't be surprised if we see another big bump of this in the face of the COVID crisis. And then also there's a new generation of entrepreneurs who are starting up their businesses as not-for-profits. And this is happening all over the world and in every sector of the economy, as I said. And because I just mentioned COVID, I might just go off on a quick little tangent to say, I was putting this presentation together, and it occurred to me, I should maybe make this really, contextualize this more for COVID. And then I realized it probably speaks for itself as we see the coronavirus pandemic highlighting the vulnerabilities of the global economy and of economies around the world. And we've seen it highlight the inequalities, we've seen it highlight the environmental connections, the connection with the growth imperative. We've seen it highlight connections with political capture and market concentration. So I felt like, okay, it's kind of just already obvious, but just to point that out in case it didn't occur to you. Yes, so going back to not-for-profit business, we like to think of it as a sort of ideal hybrid between traditional for-profit business and traditional non-profits. So like for-profit businesses, they seek to be financially self-sufficient through the sale of goods and services, and they can, in most places, make unlimited profit, but they are based on a social mission, and they have to use all of that profit for their social purpose. And they have no private owners in the sense of private financial rights again. And so what about an economy in which businesses seek only social benefit, going back to these causal loop diagrams and thinking about system dynamics? But we've gotten rid of the desire for financial gain. The profit motive is not driving this economy. So the desire for social benefit is driving it instead. And so the desire for social benefit drives investment, and some of that investment goes into the productions and ads. I would argue that planned obsolescence is a lot less likely in this kind of system, because it's not seeking profit for its own purposes. And so investment then also goes into socially beneficial activities and environmentally beneficial activities. And those, can be all kinds of things. So you have your tree planting and your conservation projects and your soil regeneration projects. Socially beneficial activities can include things like helping people facing disease or homelessness, or even just childcare, caring for other people, making food. And those two kinds of activities then go into reducing inequality and environmental damage. And the redistributive taxes and labor regulations and the environmental regulations also reduce the environmental damage and the inequality. And then as the inequality and environmental damage reduce over time, there's also sort of a balancing effect here, where there's less of a need to invest in those activities. So that's important from a post-growth perspective, because it allows for the slowing down and the shrinking of the market, of the economy. And so you'll see, whereas compared to the for-profit economy that was full of these reinforcing loops that just keep speeding things up and growing and growing, that's sort of the nature of the for-profit economy. Here, in this not-for-profit type of economy, we would expect to see a lot more balancing loops. So a lot more, literally, feedback into informing where investment goes. Do we need investment in protecting this ecosystem? Oh, maybe not. Maybe it's actually doing okay right now. So that's really important kinds of feedback that the current economy really just doesn't allow for. So, but of course it's not perfect, and to address like the consumerist concerns and that sort of thing, we might need some regulations or some lifestyle changes, and I would argue that those kinds of other sustainability interventions allow for or align much more easily with this not-for-profit type of economy than a for-profit type of economy. So, for instance, one of the things that a lot of post-growth scholars talk about is the minimalist lifestyles. So living in a much simpler way, voluntary simplicity. And so right now in the for-profit economy, it's really hard to do that because there's this growth imperative. Wages are suppressed. You're constantly driven to buy more. Things are going obsolete very quickly. So here you would imagine that, okay, we see that there's environmental damage, we want to live more minimalist lifestyles, and we can, there's nothing driving us to increase our sales as there is in a for-profit system. And also then the environmental regulations can come in and sort of put caps on that stuff, caps on production and usage of resources or pollution and those sorts of things. So these environmental regulations can be a lot more effective and help make the space for other interventions. An entirely not-for-profit market economy would allow for more equality, better satisfaction of needs. So, and when I say that, I mean not only through the economy, it actually creates the space for people to meet their needs outside of the economy in a way that it's really difficult now. So through connecting with each other, through families and community connections and connection with nature, for instance. And so less consumerism leads to more well-being and also less ecological destruction. And because there's more equality and a better satisfaction of needs, there would also be less of a need for redistribution. Yeah. And so at the very least, so I'm not saying this is a utopia and it's all going to work smoothly and all of that, but at the very least, transitioning away from for-profit to not-for-profit forms of business, not-for-profit businesses do not encourage sacrificing social benefit and ecosystems for private profit. So at the very least, they don't do that in a way that for-profit business structures do. They do not systematically drive inequality in the way that for-profit structures do. And there's also a higher level of expectations for social impact of businesses and markets. If they're not-for-profit versus for-profit. I mean, we can complain a lot about $200 million bonuses for executives on Wall Street, but actually that's part of the for-profit game. It also raises the accountability and transparency of businesses and the market, and better allows for other sustainability interventions, like I mentioned before. A lot of the time I feel like sustainable economy ideas and even post-growth economy ideas often almost assume that there's a not-for-profit economy rather than a for-profit economy that is diametrically opposed to those interventions. So another big aha moment, and I am coming to an end, I'll finish it up in about 5 minutes from now. And this was big for me, is that imagining an entirely not-for-profit market economy offers a way beyond capitalism, this dichotomy of capitalism and state-planned communism. And I think, a lot of us are aware that there is a lot of resistance to going beyond capitalism or even having discussions of going beyond capitalism, because there's this fear that the only alternative is a state-planned communism, and that means Stalin and Mao and all of these other. So this actually offers a true third way and a viable way, I would argue. So how could a transformation to a not-for-profit economy happen? I've kind of made the case that the for-profit economy is untenable. I've made the case that a not-for-profit economy would probably be a lot more sustainable. How might that transformation take place? So I think that it's this is the way I've been thinking about it, and of course this is up for discussion, that there are weaknesses of the for-profit system that are often not acknowledged or are under-acknowledged in sustainability circles. And then that combined with the strengths of for-profit business and the growing awareness of those weaknesses of the for-profit system and a growing awareness of the strengths of the not-for-profit business. So, and here I added a butterfly to represent transformation and to add some color to a presentation that is probably far too black and white. So weaknesses of the for-profit system that I'm alluding to there include that it's highly speculative, and because it's highly speculative and financialized, it's prone to crises. These bubbles that we've been experiencing over the years. It's growth dependent. And again, when I'm mentioning these weaknesses, you can probably think about the current situation with the pandemic. So it requires growth because all of that wealth is accumulating in the hands of a few people. In order to keep the rest of the economy moving, it requires growth. And that growth isn't always there, like right now. It also leads to homogenized and globalized supply chains because that's just more profitable. And so we've seen how vulnerable that makes the system, especially with the pandemic. And for instance, if the world's medical masks or gear are made in China, or certain kinds of food are made somewhere else, those supply chains are very vulnerable and they can just be stopped during a crisis. Ecological crises are a huge weakness of the for-profit system that is sweeping the rug out from under us. And the global concentration of wealth and power is prompting social unrest and a desire for a different system, which leads me to the not-for-profit advantages. And so because of this growing concern about social and environmental issues, and the calls for economic democracy and solidarity and relocalization. The not-for-profit ethos and the not-for-profit structure align much better with all of that, calling for ways forward. There's also a workforce that is increasingly motivated by purpose. And we see the rise of ethical consumption, people wanting to get their goods and services from supply chains that have been treating people and the environment properly. The not-for-profit model is also leaner in terms of not needing to distribute profit, not having that pressure to generate and distribute profit, allows it to operate more slowly when it needs to, and to save for rainy days. And then finally, there are the tax exemptions, the donations, and the volunteers that not-for-profit businesses should not be dependent on, but they can rely on to get through economic downturns. And a lot of not-for-profit businesses are realizing that they have these advantages, that they appeal to the changing ethos in the market. And so they are flaunting it, and they are marketing themselves as not-for-profits. And I've seen an increase in this just anecdotally. So here's Welsh Water, not-for-profit for Wales. We're also seeing the emergence of not-for-profit business incubators, like this green-white space. And so one way to think about this transformation from for-profit to not-for-profit, and we covered this in the How on Earth book in the 6th chapter, I believe. We sort of outline a possible scenario for a transformation. Incidentally, it starts with a big crash in 2020. We wrote it in 2016. And so there's no need to think about these three waves that we talked about, but just thinking about there are shifts that can happen, that can erode, and that the for-profit world becomes weaker due to its internal contradictions and weaknesses, and the not-for-profit world then could take up more and more of that space. Some practical actions that can happen to push things in this direction as citizens and activists and consumers can really push for this transition, removing power from incumbent for-profit companies, especially the largest transnational ones, and supporting not-for-profit businesses. Entrepreneurs and business leaders can start to also shift their business models in a not-for-profit direction, or go completely not-for-profit. Non-profit employees and managers can start moving their non-profit entities or non-profit organizations into business and start generating more financial self-sufficiency, which also allows for more control over the way that they run their organization and pursue their social mission. Civil servants and governments can work for policies that both withdraw support from these incumbent, especially the largest for-profit actors, and offer support to the not-for-profits. So one simple way is thinking of public procurement. When governments have to buy things, they could, for instance, favor not-for-profit businesses over for-profits, and smaller for-profits over large for-profits. And researchers and educators like myself, we can talk about these different alternatives that are out there and stop reinforcing this story that businesses and entrepreneurs and markets have to be for profit. So what if the future of the economy is not for profit? What if we go in a totally different direction? And I just want to wrap up by saying that the not-for-profit world is not a panacea, and it's not a utopia or a silver bullet. It's not going to cure everything. But it is a realistic bridge from what we have now to something more sustainable and enjoyable. It's Donnie and I and others at the Post-Growth Institute, we talk about it as necessary but not sufficient. And so we would also need, in addition to this transition to not-for-profit businesses, we need relocalization, of course. We need a more circular economy, a culture of sufficiency, and ecological regeneration, because we are beyond the point where we just need to protect the environment. We actually need to regenerate ecosystems. And so the final question that I leave you with is to ask about any proposal for a sustainable economy. Could it work in a for-profit economy with the dynamics that are at work in a for-profit economy? Or does it require a not-for-profit transition? And thank you very much. And here is a link to our book, How on Earth. You can find it at this website, archive or arxiv.org. And the article that I recently published with all of those causal loop diagrams is called Fit for Purpose, clarifying the critical role of profit for sustainability at the Journal of Political Ecology. And feel free to contact me with any questions you have. Thanks.